So I was born in 1966, July 4th, and Columbus, Ohio. And probably the best way to describe my childhood is I had a very sheltered childhood. I was probably a perfect childhood if you were to look at it by how the world would judge a childhood. We were spoiled. I had an older brother, a younger brother, and eventually had a younger sister. Played all the sports. My dad coached us in all the sports, and really had everything that you could possibly imagine. So I came of age in the late 70s going into the 80s, and if you look back at the history of our country, it was really an affluent time. You know, my dad was a business owner. He had a heating and cooling company, and we basically had anything we wanted. The first milestone, if I look at my life, would be at age 12, smoking a cigarette. That was the first time I smoked a cigarette. And then the major milestone was at age 16. I had a brother who was 2 years older, who was getting ready to go to college. And I came home to find my brother dead. You can inhale Freon and get a buzz, and that's what he was doing. So with Freon, if you hold the jug one way, it'll come out gas. If you hold it the other way or turn it upside down, it comes out liquid. So at some point, when he was inhaling it, he passed out and the jug flipped and it came out liquid and froze his lungs. So when I found him, he was completely blue. I remember trying to give him mouth to mouth and just breathing into him, and the breath coming back can only be described as what death tastes like. And at that point, I don't remember much at that point. After that, we were Catholic. We'd go to church twice a year, Christmas and Easter primarily. So the Catholic Church's answer to where my brother was at was not one that gave me any solace or relief. So as a result of that, I began studying all the religions of the world. So just trying to get an answer to where my brother was. As far as the impact that had on my family, you know, being a family that virtually had no really belief in God, I saw my dad's hair go from, you know, brown to white overnight. You could not talk about the situation because it was so painful. All the pictures of my brother were removed from the house, and it was just taboo to even speak of it. That's how my family dealt with it. I had a little bit of bitterness with God because of all the pain that caused my family. So I started studying the other religions, and what I would do is I would pull little pieces from different religions that kind of would fit into my paradigm in regards to where my brother was at. So I found myself, you know, kind of grabbing on to some of the Eastern philosophies of reincarnation. You know, it made sense. You know, he's coming back, he gets to try again. So that, you know, I can maybe, you know, respect a God that would do that. But that ended up turning into just this really eclectic spiritual perspective to where as I became more into pleasing myself and more selfish as I grew up, I would grab on to the beliefs that would serve me the best eventually. From 16 on, I kind of had a live for today attitude where, you know, let's party hard today for there may be no tomorrow. And in the process, forming this eclectic spiritual view to where, you know, if it could serve me or my flesh, it was part of my religious paradigm. And what that looked like, eventually, it evolved into, you know, I read tarot cards, I meditated. I was into manifestation. In other words, creating life circumstances through different types of meditations. I was into black magic. I was into shamanism, Reiki healing, and most of it was just a venue through which I could serve myself and my flesh. But through that whole process, I really did have a desire to know who God was. So from age 16 all the way till 35, that's what I was going through. And, you know, my spiritual beliefs would change as I found different beliefs that served me better, if that makes any sense. And there's lots of them out there. what I didn't realize is that going through this, all my beliefs, I was serving the kingdom of darkness and not God. There are lots of gods with a small g out there that want to, that bide for your attention. A lot of the stuff that people think of as witchcraft and things like that, people don't realize how real that stuff is. And that was the part that appealed to me, the ability to be able, the power that came with being able to utilize that. And essentially what you're doing, and without going into it too much, is, you're forming agreements with entities that aren't out for your best interest. And as a result, you're making agreements with them where they'll serve you, but you have to serve them as well. I was 35 before I really started seeing that. One thing that I had found out is that I was really good at sales, and I was really good at manipulating people, and using my manipulation skills to sell things. I was probably one of the foulest people you'd ever want to meet. In a conversation this short, I would have thrown out the F-bomb probably 100 times by now. The type of sales I was really good at was in-home direct sales, where I would go into somebody's home and sell them some type of home improvement. It was all about control, being able to control a situation, and again, using manipulating techniques to sell them something. At the time I was 35, I was in Florida. My sister had gotten a recording contract for an all-female group. And her manager was actually Justin Timberlake's mother, and she needed an adult to be able to oversee her. My parents couldn't go down. She was 16 at the time, so I moved to Florida, and got a real feel for what the music industry was all about. And I was kind of, I was older than a lot of the people, so I was, because of these different spiritual beliefs, I was somewhat of a guru. I started moving up in an industry in Florida, was residential water treatment, where you sell water softeners and drinking water systems. I had gotten really good at the sales part. I'd started getting recruited by bigger companies. And in this process of moving from one company to another, what I would do is go in and I would interview all the salespeople and see if any of them were worthy to work for me. It would take me about 15 minutes, and if I felt like I wanted to keep them, I would know after that 15 minutes. So I'd evolved to another company. I was in the process of interviewing the salespeople, and there were 3 guys waiting for me when I got into the office that day. And the guy in the middle, I could just tell right away that there was something different about him. He was a older, small Jamaican man. And again, the only way I can describe it is I could just tell there was something different about him. So I interviewed the first guy, and then when he came in the office, and I interviewed him, it was like, it didn't take very long where actually he was interviewing me, which was kind of unsettling for me because I was very good at controlling the conversation, and especially in an interview scenario. And at one point I said, listen, I feel like you're interviewing me to see if, I should be interviewing you right now. So I ended up keeping him because he intrigued me, and found out later that he was he's a 60-year-old Jamaican man, had his own house church, Christian paradigm. And at that time in my life, when somebody would approach me who was a Christian, I would just eat them alive, because usually they weren't real strong Christians, and I could propose questions to them that they couldn't answer. There were times where I had Christians leaning towards my beliefs. But I threw out a question to him one day that I had proposed to many Christians before. And he had an answer that made sense to me in a Christian paradigm, whereas nobody before had answered it that way. And as a result, he invited me to his house church. And it was at that house church that I met Jesus. It was during the praise and worship before his sermon. And the only way I can describe it is God meets us where we're at. And he knew my life. He knew the shoes that I had walked in. And if I was going to be a Christian, there had to be a supernatural side to it, because I knew the supernatural side was real as us talking right now. And it was in that praise and worship where he just touched me. He just gave me a little glimpse of his love. That's the only way I can describe it. I don't know how. It seemed like I was taken away for an extended period of time, but in this earthly realm, it was only a matter of seconds or even a minute. But I got a taste of what his love, and from that moment forward, that's when my heart changed. And at that service, when I accepted Christ as my Savior, and I'll never forget the feeling that I had when I did that, because I guess the best way to describe it is I actually felt clean, washed, refreshed. You know, we're in a barn right now. When we load this hay and stack it, and it's usually hot, it's usually August, the stubble gets all over you, and you can't wait to take a shower because it's just all over you. And when you finally do take a shower, it's like the best shower that you ever took. That's kind of how I felt when I accepted Christ. I felt clean. Shortly after being saved, I got married. Initially, the marriage was a good marriage. What happened was I got involved with work a little bit too much, and I wasn't the husband that I needed to be. I fell short in a lot of ways. And over a period of 5 years, it was to a point where my wife ended up having an affair with the owners of a company that I work for, one of the owners. We ended up getting divorced. And at that time I moved back to Ohio. My brother was struggling with addiction, and my mom's health wasn't well, so I ended up moving back to Ohio. During that time that I kind of fell away from the Lord a little bit, that was 2008. I accepted Christ at 35 in 2001. 2011, my sister's daughter at age 6 months came down with cancer, liver cancer. And it was during this time that I started praying again, and usually it was praying for her. The only way I can describe it is I maybe reestablished a connection with God, and through my prayers for my niece, began to fellowship with the Spirit in the form of prayer every morning. I'd get up early for her and pray for her. And then through her battling the cancer and eventually dying, and seeing the impact that had on my sister and brother-in-law and how they handled that. They were both believers, and that kind of reconnected me to God. So if you look back at my life, I think the years that really stand out to me is the year that my brother died, the year that I got saved, which was 2001. Another big year for me was 2012. In 2012 is when I met my current wife. At the time, I lived on a small farm, 17-acre farm. The commonality we had is we both had goats, and in a really brief courtship, we got married in May of 2012. I really don't understand why she married me. I know that God had a plan, but I think God blinded her in a lot of ways, because even I got saved and really was used to a more charismatic type church where, she was more in churches that really got into the Word and were really grounded in the Word. So in the first couple years of our marriage, we were trying to find this middle place where we could both dwell, where, my background and her background. The day I got married, I also got 3 daughters. I never had any kids before. And the circumstances in my wife's first marriage was her husband had cheated on her. So there was a lot of pain, not only with her, but with the daughters. And at the time we got married, her girls, and I say my girls now, were 15, 12, and 10. They had a pretty good idea of the father they wanted to have, because they had lost their father and they didn't really have a relationship with him. I think that they recognized that I wasn't that man quite yet, but they prayed for me diligently and corrected me when they needed to. And between marrying a woman that was much more spiritually mature than me and having 3 daughters who had a sense of the godly father they wanted to have, really had a huge impact in my maturity level, because my wife was so mature that she could only mature so fast. There was so much of a difference between us. It was really easy for me to start decreasing the gap between us. And for me, what really played a big part in that was getting into the Word and experiencing God through His Word. Prior to that, I was always about the experience, because I came to God through an experience. Prior to accepting Christ, my typical day would, I got up in the morning, usually worked out, went to work, usually worked anywhere from 10 to 12 hours. Upon getting off work, usually went to a bar and, usually, drank or partaked in some other type of drug, and then did the same thing the next morning. The day that I accepted Christ, the desire to do any of that was gone. Prior to Jesus, if I had a desire to drink or to drug, I would just have the desire and do it. After Jesus, I would have the desire from time to time, but there was a moment where, the Spirit would get in there and encourage me to count the cost of that next action. And in most cases, there were some times when I made the wrong decision, but for the most part, counting the cost for me played huge in me not using drugs or alcohol. The hard part for me was, going from a guy who's as worldly as they get, as foul as they get, in an industry with salespeople, changing overnight was really kind of weird for the people that I was working with. And some of the guys that I work with, it actually brought them to Christ as well, because they knew who I was and they saw who I was now, and that made it real, made God real to them. But I got to tell you, man, it was a struggle, because everything I did was, if I would do anything to close a deal, I would lie. I had 25 sales reps who worked for me. Before they could leave the home, they had to call me to tell me they couldn't get the sale. And then they would put me on the phone with the people who were looking to buy. And I had 100 different lies that I could tell them to rationalize the price drop, on why we could do it cheaper or whatever. So it was really interesting, trying to get to a place where I could even do a price drop and not feel condemned. But it was a cool process, a process that even today, God still refines me in that way, to where, I want to be overly honest with people. I probably fail on the other side of it now, where I'm too honest with people, if there is such a thing. When I got saved at 35, I knew right away that God had called me to help young men who struggle with addiction. In January 2015, a guy that I was thinking about mentoring, we're getting to know each other, and he had 2 children that his aunt had custody of, and she was not going to keep them anymore. He asked me if my wife and I would consider taking his kids in for a couple months until he could get a different voucher to where he could, his kids could live with him. The conclusion we came to, if we were going to do it, we had to be willing to do it for good, even though the premise of the deal was to do it short term. So we agreed. He fell off the wagon again. He used again, was not able to provide a home. We had to get children's services involved. And the long and the short of it is we did eventually get custody, and we still have custody of the full-time custody of the children. So that was January of 2015. So 2 months after we took the kids into their home, I woke up one night in March, went to the bathroom, and on my way back to bed, my feet were completely numb, as if they were asleep. We called the squad came out. I thought maybe I was stroking or having a heart attack. At the emergency room, one of the doctors on staff felt like my symptoms matched up to something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a disease where your immune system attacks your peripheral nervous system. And as a result, there's different levels of it, but you pretty much you're paralyzed. They did a spinal tap to confirm that I had it, and it did confirm that I had it. Within 24 hours, I was completely intubized. I was life support, and it would be the first day of a 110-day stint in ICU. The first 40 days of which I was fully paralyzed. The type of GBS that I have, or Guillain-Barré that I have, was called axonal GBS, which means not only does it attack your nerves, but it also goes for the lining. You get extensive damage to the lining of your nerves. So I had a very extreme case. So looking back, had I not woke up to go to the bathroom, I more than likely would have suffocated in my sleep. God saw fit to have a doctor on duty who had recently read an article about it, and they were able to diagnose it right away, which also played a part in me surviving it. And then having the extensive damage that I had done, not only was I very likely that I wouldn't survive, even, continue living, but it was also very likely that I would never walk again. After 110 days in ICU, and then a 2-month stint actually 3 months, in extended care facility in a nursing home, I did come back home. What transpired as a result of that, you look at the fact that we had 2 new little children in our home, And if Joe didn't have the ability to be with me at the hospital and just advocate on my behalf, I would have died for sure, because that's just the way our health system is right now. So so we have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old in our home, while Jill has to be at the hospital every day to help fight for my life. And you might think that that isn't a very good situation to put our younger daughters in. You know, at the time they were 14 and 16. But God uses all things. For them, it was a tremendous period of growth, because they learned essentially how to raise kids, which might be a skill that could come in handy later in life. A lot of people, when they would hear about it, they would say, I can't believe Satan did that to you, because they saw the outward things that I was doing, and they just assumed that that was maybe an attack from Satan to take me out. But I'll make the argument that that was God who did that, because he had tried to slow me down. And the only way that he could slow me down was to give me an affliction such as that. And I look at it probably one of the biggest blessings in my life, because it changed the lens through which I see the world now. There's so many things that we take for granted. It was tough when I first got home, because I was still paralyzed, not able to walk. So, you know, I live in my home is at a very beautiful place. So it's tough not being able to get out and in it. You can't really go around on a farm in a wheelchair. For me, this place, it motivated me to get out of bed and be able to walk, because again, I wasn't sure if that was going to be able to occur. The Bible tells us one of the main reasons why God puts us in situations and circumstances is so that we can help others who are in the same situation or circumstance get through it. So for me, if you look back at my entire life, you know, my brother dying at 16 from trying to catch a buzz, to the addiction that I had stints in my life where I was sober, you know, maybe 3 months or 2 months where, you know, I decided it, but it didn't last. And the reason why is because I wasn't free from it. There's ways you can manage an addiction, and there's lots of people who manage addiction. But if you want to be free from addiction, the only way you can be free is through a relationship with Christ.
I just wanna be where you are and follow you around, and just to hear the sound of your words, 'cause they just captivate and steal my breath away. It's more than I can take. Oh, and you have saved my life. You saved my life. You saved my life. Oh, and you have saved my life. You saved my life. You saved my life.